I'm Antoine from Bloomberg NEF, BNEF for short. For those of you who don't know us, we're a research organisation. We were bought by Bloomberg a bit more than 10 years ago, and we produce research. We started out producing research on wind and solar and power markets, and since branched out in many directions like advanced transport and materials, and off-grid sector, which is something that we're going to be talking a bit more about today in this discussion. And yeah, there are about 250 of us across 17 different offices. But we've come to talk about something a bit different today, which is energy in Africa. And this is something that's worth approaching from a number of angles. So we've got quite a varied sort of array of panelists with us today from different sectors. And all of them are dealing with the sort of challenges that the continent's facing. So a number that gets cited pretty often is 600 million Africans lack energy today. And that's about 2/3 of the continent's population. So how do we go about dealing with that? And how do we go about dealing with the fact that, according to our estimations, energy demand with industrialization, with rising living standards, with electrification are going to be ballooning, quadrupling within the next 3 decades from what they are currently now. So there are a number of ways of looking at this, and something that's been talked about a lot recently is universal access to energy by 2030. So a lot of governments in sub-Saharan Africa have said they'll be providing electricity to all of their citizens, either rural or on a national level, by 2030. The dates sort of vary. But that's about a bit more than half of all governments in the region. And even if all of those targets were met, which is pretty unlikely, you still have about 500 million people 400, 500 million people in the continent still lacking access to electricity. So there are a number of ways of dealing with this. At a government level, centralized sort of attempt to expand the transmission network has long been the preferred option. And it makes sense when you have a lot of load, you have a lot of customers in a given region. It's expensive to do, and some countries have been better at doing it than others. Like there's a good coverage in countries like Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. And whereas in extreme examples like the DRC, within the next sort of large swathes of it are probably not going to be seeing any kind of transmission infrastructure within the next 50 years. So that's a solution that's imperfect. And given the fact that governments have struggled to expand infrastructure, we've seen a number of actors step in and provide different solutions. So we're going to go through a few of these before starting the panel. One of these is mini-grids. So these can take a number of forms. But mini-grids, or microgrids, as they're sometimes called, are basically sort of distribution networks serving a given community with 1 or 2 generation units. And they're useful for when you want to aggregate a number of customers' load profiles, and can be competitive against transmission networks. There's also solar home systems, with pay-as-you-go solar being a business model that's emerged over the last 10 years, and in East Africa to begin with, and has spread since. And we're seeing a lot of competition in the sector recently. We're seeing a lot of companies that were once integrated, providing the whole bundle of services, sort of specialized, and a lot of evolution in that sense. But both of these sort of microgrids and solar home systems, there's common issues that link them regarding access to finance and subsidies, and how to go about making sure that the money is available to electrify off-grid areas. And that's something we'll be talking about. It's not just about electrification, it's also about improving the quality of energy that's available, and that's where the CNI sector steps in. So CNI sector is commercial and industrial, and that involves solar developers building arrays and selling electricity directly to businesses. And that's something that we've seen take off recently in Africa, in particular in countries like Nigeria, for example, where a business can have outages of about 30 hours a month or more. And we've seen about 74 megawatts of CNI solar installed across sub-Saharan Africa, if you don't include South Africa, which has a lot more than that. And we expect that to double over the next year. So these are all different solutions. They're all quite varied, and they have their different use cases, and there's a lot of debate about those use cases. And there's a lot of debate, again, about how to ensure that the money and the credit is available for expanding energy access in the continent, improving the quality of that power supply. So without further ado, I'd like you to give a hand to our panelists who are representing us, well, who are going to be talking about this today. So you can have a round of applause. And I'll ask you to introduce yourselves. So starting with Andres.
Well, hello, good morning, everyone. I might be better using this. My name is Andres Gonzales. I've been a researcher at the Universal Energy Access Lab of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Comillas University for the last 10 years. And now we have just started a spin-off, which is called Waya Energy. Waya is wire in Swahili. And it's, the purpose of this company is to provide solutions for governments, for companies, for entrepreneurs, to foster energy access in general. We have been developing several tools. One of them is a large planning tool, Homer-like, but applied to millions of households at the same time in the same country, and with network design as well. Well, I just want to mention a few things. One is, well, you have seen this image tons of times, but I wanted to focus on Africa for a moment. Well, the world is, there's inequality also in energy distribution, and this has a large impact in development and the capacity to develop productive activities, as Antoine has already told us. And I just want to bring a zoom into a small country in the middle of Africa, which is Rwanda. This is Rwanda by night in 2017. So you have Kigali in the center, and actually the electrification level at that moment in Rwanda was 32% of the people was connected. Now it's 37, so it's improving. But still, there's a lot of way to go. So how we started by developing microgrids in small villages in Rwanda 6 years ago. And from them, we realized that when we were finishing a microgrid, then someone decided to electrify that village that was never going to be electrified by the grid. Then suddenly the grid started getting there by some magic resolution by the government. So actually the government asked us to develop the National Electrification Plan of Rwanda, which is that one, aiming for universal access in 2024. So they want to leave no one behind in 2024. First things I want to tell about that is that no single technology is going to achieve that at the least cost level. So there's going to be a mix, and that mix is comprised of grid energy for 52% of the population, microgrids for up to 18% of the population. That means thousands of microgrid only in Rwanda. That you can see it's a 200 kilometers by 200 kilometers country. So it's like 20 times smaller than Germany. And also millions, up to maybe 2 million only in Rwanda, isolated systems or solar kits. That is kind of the plan of the government at the moment. But true is, this is not going to stay there forever. We need to build the conditions so all these electrification supply models and other business models that are going to be around them coexist in a rational manner, because in 2030 maybe they are thinking about something different, which is, okay, the grid is going to get almost everywhere. And what happens to the microgrids and to the solar kits that were there? They may remain there. They may have an interaction with the grid. So what are the policy, which ones are the regulatory mechanisms that would make all this possible, that would make microgrid developers sure of their investments in the long term? So what happens when the grid reaches? What happens if I'm overtaken? What happens if I get connected? Would I stay? In which fashion? Would I still be profitable? And that same goes for solar kit solars. What's happening to the millions of batteries that in 5 or 10 years are going to be there, some of them tossed into rivers because they are just thrown away, or who's going to recycle them? So all those things the government needs to think about when they're thinking about massive deployment. The cost of this plan is around $1 billion in 7 years. $1 to $2 billion if you consider generation and everything else. And who's going to risk that money? I mean, the government doesn't have the money. The utility is not as in a bad shape as other utilities in Africa, but it's not good as well. They don't want to connect the last mile because for every customer that they connect, they're going to lose more money because the tariffs are not well designed. So you need to see first things. You are never going to reach the last mile if you don't provide subsidies. Subsidies, upfront subsidies, long-term subsidies, long discussion. But you need subsidies for the last mile. The International Energy Agency doesn't think universal access is going to happen in Africa in 2030. They still think 500 million people is going to lag behind. They are not going to break connection 2030. I mean, this is in the last World Energy Outlook. So actually, you need a change in the mindset and the way you're promoting this if you want actually to leave no one behind. And that is kind of what we're trying to propose. Let's make a framework which takes care of all the different technologies that are up in there and that in the long term are going to have to coexist. So it is viable, it is sustainable, and actually you can attract the kind of capital that is going to provide $1 billion to Rwanda, $12 billion to Mozambique, where we also developed the National Electrification Plan, $50 billion in Nigeria, $100 billion in Kenya. So all these actually, as in InnoEnergy is trying to sponsor heavy assets, companies, not only, because also when you're talking about millions of solar kits, that's also millions of solar kits. They're growing a lot, but still reaching the last isolated communities in the middle of Congo is going to be a challenge, even for solar kits. So how are you going to do it, and how are you making that sustainable? How are you going to take care of the long-term service of those communities? And mainly, how are you going to make this compatible, or how this is going to contribute to sustainable development in many senses in the region? How are you going to produce economic growth with them? How are you going to power economic activities or productive activities? So all that is our work in 3 minutes or around that. I'm happy to leave a message to the next.
Emma?
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Emma Patmore. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager for Ecoligo. We provide businesses in emerging markets with solar energy. So the problem is that in many emerging markets, for example, in Ghana, Kenya, and Costa Rica, where we are working, the energy price is really, really high. And this has a direct impact on businesses. They can't grow, and then that has then, again, an impact on the local economy. Also, of course, a problem which is more relevant globally is that the energy that they're using is mostly coming from fossil fuels. The businesses know that they can save energy, costs by using solar energy, but it's not as easy as it is in Europe to just go and get a solar system for your business. So there are two main reasons for this. One of them is finance. If you go to a bank in Ghana, for example, and ask for a loan for your solar system, they're going to give you like 20% interest rates, which is obviously not feasible. The other one is the maintenance. So it's the businesses don't want to directly maintain a system, install a system, and have to worry about that. And also in the past, many systems have been implemented that then were not looked after, which meant that they fall into disrepair, the businesses don't have the energy anymore, and you get a kind of a bad image of solar energy in these regions. So Ecoligo is solving that, of course. We have a fully financed solar as a service solution. So what this means is that we provide all of the services to the customers. So we install the system, we work with our local technical partners to maintain it, and the customer just has to pay monthly or pay a set amount for the energy that they're using. And we finance the systems through crowd investing. So we have a crowd investing platform here in Germany. It's called ecoligo.investments, and it allows private investors to go on and invest in these projects, making a nice return and knowing that their investment is sustainable and also tangible, which is something that's lacking here in Europe. So of course there's an impact of this. So first of all, we've financed 33 projects so far on the platform with a financing volume of 3.2 million euros. These projects, over the lifetime of the projects, will save 40,000 tons of CO2 emissions, and we're really only in the beginning of this. And then the second big impact is on sustainable development. So these regions are areas of the world where we're going to see the most development over the coming years. If these businesses and if these industries develop in the same way that we have, by emitting millions of tons of fossil fuels, then we're going to have a much bigger problem. But we have an opportunity here to allow these businesses and these countries to leapfrog into renewable energy and to use clean energy to grow their business. So that's really what our goal is at Ecoligo.
Yeah, I'm Felix Bolt. I'm heading SolarWorks. It's also a company that does solar electrification in Africa, mostly in rural areas. So we're very much focused on smaller SMEs and individuals. And SolarWorks in itself is actually only 1.5 years old, but my personal journey in Africa started already 7 years ago, working for another company called Mobisol, where we electrified, mostly in Tanzania, Kenya, and Rwanda, villages with solar home systems, actually the first of their kind. It was pretty new, this pay-go model, where people would get an asset, relatively expensive for them, not for us. We're talking about maybe an investment of 500 to 1,000 euro. They could get it basically for just a down payment of 10%. They would have that system delivered to the doorstep, even installed, maintained over a couple of years, and basically microfinanced. Now, this model was only made possible basically by the availability of mobile money. It's something that in Africa was already starting with a company called Safaricom. They introduced M-Pesa, where people could basically transfer money from phone to phone, from phone to company, within seconds, any small amount whatsoever. And this made it possible to actually have end customers being bankable in those areas, because collecting cash in Africa, I know this from personal experience quite badly, is corruption is super high. So the likeliness of your $1 that's being collected in the field in the last mile arriving at your headquarter in Nairobi or in Arusha is quite low, at least not the full $1. So mobile money is an absolute necessity. But so we had a lot of lessons learned from working for Mobisol. We have expanded this. We have electrified 500,000 people in East Africa. SolarWorks does things a bit different. The original focus was mostly on lighting, on replacing the absolute basic needs. Then more and more people also wanted to have a TV, which is a very commercial kind of product. And I believe this is where it started to go into the wrong direction. So at SolarWorks, we are now providing systems that also meet this demand of basic lighting, basic phone charging, and whatsoever. But our systems are completely modular, so you can grow them like Lego bricks, stack them up as your pocket allows it. You can make another investment into you expanding your device, basically. We're selling those systems all B2B, so to local distribution partners. We're currently in, I think, 7 or 8 countries or so at the moment. And now the idea is, because we can grow the systems gradually, we now enable people to also become productive, as in running water pumps, running maize grinders on those systems, because most people in Africa, especially in the rural areas, they live from agriculture. So enabling them to increase their harvest amount and so on really, really helps them to create local value. So yeah, this is where we come from. We have a new innovation where we can interconnect those existing solar home systems and ours within a certain thing. We call it a DC mesh. It's kind of like meeting what the regular AC mini grid already does, but on a DC level. And on a much smaller level, we can even start electrifying communities of only 10 individuals, where AC mini grids wouldn't make sense at all, and also where no AC connection would ever reach from the government. So it's a very holistic approach from an individual household to a whole community. Everything is grown bottom up. We are working purely B2B with partners on the ground.
So hi, I'm Eduardo Appleyard. I think the previous panelists are very tough act to follow, I have to say. Very impressive. So I can tell you a bit of my background. I used to work for SolarAid, a British NGO that was trying to promote the use of solar PV primarily in rural Africa and in other places in other developing countries, but primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. And I used to work for their social enterprise called Sunny Money. This is back in 2012 in Kenya. And at the time, Sunny Money used to be, at the time, perhaps the biggest distributor of pico solar products in the continent. The sector has evolved incredibly over the years, but at the time, just selling the smallest and most basic lighting system, solar lighting system, was already a challenge. But the mission of that social enterprise was to try to increase access to this most basic level of electrification to the highest number of people possible, in order to increase exposure and hopefully to pave the way for what came next. And actually, I was involved in some of the early trials of pay-as-you-go and have seen the growth of the space incredibly over the last years. It's amazing to see where it is today and the number of smaller companies that are coming up in the space and so on, the technology, the know-how and so on. Over the last 8 years, I've done a variety of things. I've left Solar Aid and Sunny Money, and I think the most relevant thing to mention here is my work over the last 4.5, 5 years with the United Nations Capital Development Fund. They have a program called Clean Start, which basically provides financing for energy enterprises and financial institutions that engage in energy lending for energy access. And primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, a little bit in Asia, but there was more challenges in Asia. Actually, one of the things that Felix was mentioning, I think in terms of energy financing, end user financing, we're seeing much more innovation and success in sub-Saharan Africa, East Africa in particular. So over the last few years, I've been involved in a variety of projects. I will tell you a bit more while we're during the panel discussion. One thing I can tell you is that I've seen the change of a program which initially was looking at supporting energy enterprises by working with the local banks and microfinance institutions, thinking that these entities would be providing loans for the consumers, for the businesses and so on. But even to this day, that's not really happening. The people that are providing loans to the consumers are companies such as Felix's, such as Mobisol, effectively. They provide an asset finance, and the company and the local banks are not providing enough credit to the local companies involved in the space, or multinationals such as Mobisol and so on, Mcopa, I can mention quite a few, that are doing great work in their countries. They're still struggling to secure local debt financing. So things have changed a lot, but the same type of challenges are still, we're still seeing them in the field. So I guess I'll leave it to that. And currently I'm working as a consultant in the space, just want to mention that. But yeah, in transition. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Being the last makes it a lot easier because I can build on many useful things that have been said before. My name is Stefan Liebing. I'm the CEO of a company called Conjuncta based in Hamburg, and we do project development in the wider infrastructure space with a focus on developing and emerging markets. Sometimes also a bit of a small investment ourselves. We have had the pleasure of being involved in investment projects or infrastructure projects on the African continent over the past 10 years in a range of $5 billion in one way or another. And while doing that, I've collected a number of strange hobbies. The first one is I have the pleasure of chairing the German African Business Association, which is the group of German businesses active on the African continent. You might have heard of Ostausschuss or similar organizations, so each of them covers a certain part of the world, and we are the Ostausschuss for Africa, if you wish. In my organization, I have about 80%, members are 80% of those German businesses that do invest on the African continent today. I'm calling this as a hobby since it's unpaid to chair the board of that organization, but we have an office in Berlin and Hamburg and about 30 full-time people working on improving business relations with Africa. I got a second hobby, and it's to teach about business in Africa. I was appointed honorary professor at Flensburg University recently on business in Africa, and it's called honorary because it's also unpaid. And since I like hobbies relating to Africa, I'm also an honorary consul of Cameroon in Hamburg, which again is unpaid, as the name would suggest. Now, Let me try to just make one or two remarks on the energy sector, and I think a lot of useful things have been said before. First of all, I believe while we have a record year of German investment on the African continent in 2018, we are still behind when it comes to energy and certainly renewable energy in terms of what Germany can, or German investors can contribute on the African continent. Nigeria today has more people, more inhabitants than Russia. And Nigeria in 30 years from now is going to have more people than Russia and the US together. So you see the challenge, and I think the Minister of Development here in Berlin has done the numbers, and he believes that if we can create 20 million new jobs on the African continent every year, we are just about to compensate for population growth. 20 million. The entire European Union last year in a boom year has created 14 million new jobs. So driven by the migration crisis, a lot of Africans trying to make their way through the Mediterranean Sea, etc., come to Europe. I think there's a lot more political attention. You might have heard of the G20 initiatives that Chancellor Merkel has initiated, of the Marshall Plan and others. And my business association is trying to involve German industry in investing and work with the German government to set the framework right. Now, when it comes to renewables, I believe we have three main business models to follow. One is utility scale, large type of PV or wind parks. And in fact, things are not so bad. It's just that Germans are not too much involved. Ghana has put up a moratorium. They don't accept any more new PPAs at the moment because they are oversubscribed in terms of investors who want to come and build huge solar PV parks. Ethiopia 2 weeks ago has signed with Saudi Arabia 2 times 125 megawatts, 2 projects at, I believe, $2.5 per kilowatt hour, which is a record low price. And that is why I believe there is no subsidy needed at all in Africa, because you compete with 25, 30 cents per kilowatt hours diesel gensets. Now, while rural electrification is important, we should not forget about the big cities that are getting bigger and bigger. I'll be hosting a commissioner from Lagos State government in Nigeria next week here in Berlin. He has to organize, in his case, healthcare for 24 million people in one big city. And they are all running on diesel gensets because there's no reliable electricity. I think the total of Nigeria with its 180 million people is about maybe 2,000 megawatts. Sometimes they are even all operational. So you see what the challenge is on the big scale level. And then, of course, we have equally important the second level, which is what our colleague here is doing with industrial off-takers. I think that's maybe the easiest one because all the developers are keen to find credit-worthy private companies, international companies as off-takers. So I would say that's maybe the easiest one in terms of financing, certainly not in terms of the challenges you described. Now, if that's the case, you can see that most of the startups and the developers coming in internationally are looking for those, and most of those who are in need have actually bought a solution already. Now, the third sector is the small mini microgrid, rooftop, individual sets, etc. piece. And I believe for each of the three, the main obstacle is financing, but the challenges are different. So for the big utility scale projects, they are all project finance because none of the state companies can afford just buying some of these things. So you look for IPP investors to come in, bring private money. Now imagine I would go to Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt and I would say, look, I need $100 million from you. And the security I can offer is a contract in which the Mozambican energy supplier promises for the next 20 years to every month to pay for their electricity bill. I can assure you, you would not be allowed in, but rather diverted to the medical department of Deutsche Bank. Yeah, they wouldn't even look at it. So the first thing we need to do is we need to strengthen creditworthiness of these state companies. And one of the proposals we've made to government here is instead of inventing new classical development project subsidies, to put up an insurance and a fund that German developers can use, where they can insure themselves against failure of payment of these off-takers. And I'm sure the day we have this, German Energiewende know-how can electrify the continent. So this is number one. There's a few more things on the other business models, but maybe that's something we can cover in the next round.
Absolutely. So that was a lot of different themes that we're going to explore during this session. But one of the things that I think is relevant across a few of them is this idea of local financing, and it's something that is talked about a lot in terms of utility scale projects, CNI solar, and also at the pay-as-you-go and mini-grid level. And I mean, there have been programs that have been started and have failed, such as the ones that Eduardo mentioned. There's also been promise that a lot of companies offering sort of hedging products, so financial futures that allow you to sort of hedge risk and close deals in local currency, but they're very often too expensive to be worth it. But what's your opinion on your respective sectors? What's the next step forward, and are we doomed in some way of relying on asset financing from companies from outside Africa? Are we going to see any commercial funding coming from local banks outside of South Africa? So any of you want to take that?
So I can only talk for our PAYGO market and the individual solar system market. I don't really believe at the moment, and not for the next few years, that governments will actively fund this. Few exceptions, maybe Rwanda with Kagame, he's a different guy, but most other countries wouldn't really do that. So, but what I've seen quite promising is a joint venture between a DESCO company, which is a distributor of solar off-grid products mostly, with a local MFI, which is a microfinance institution. So what those guys have is they have a lot of expertise on farmers. They have already granted loans to tons of guys. They have proven their credit worthiness. But what those MFIs don't have is the technological skill to decide which solution a person should really buy. So they really completely depend on the decision that the end customer is doing on purchasing a certain asset. But if you have the DESCO company, whom are experts in installation and maintenance of those products, and merging it with the MFI, this is something that I can see working. We have a few companies trying this out at the moment, like Baobab Plus in Côte d'Ivoire, and they're also in Senegal. And they're doing exactly that, and there's a couple of more coming up. Also, we are trying this currently with our distributor in Cameroon with a MFI called Crédit du Sahel. So I think for our particular market, that is one of the most promising solutions at the moment.
Thank you. Anyone else have anything to add? Eduardo, maybe?
Yeah, I think the question was kind of open-ended, I think, but to comment on what Felix has said, I think, so just about a year ago, I was at the European Microfinance Week, and I was actually the moderator in a panel which included people from Finca, actually, which is another example of an MFI that initially created a kind of a spin-off solar, Pico Solar and other product distributor in Uganda, and they kind of had this model where they had the microfinance expertise and they needed the energy expertise. And at that panel session, this is a year ago, when you were talking to the microfinance scene, they still had a lot of skepticism and questions about it. It's almost like, you know, having the same conversation for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, and you're still hearing the same questions. I think it's getting better, and I think such companies like Baobab Plus were, I think, doing well, and I think they were partnering with Mobisol or something like that, no? Or they were working together, I think. Yeah, okay, yeah, something like that. I think that's promising, but I'm not 100% sure whether the microfinance sector, whether that's going to become a kind of a widespread example of success across different countries, because also the microfinance sector is not so well developed across sub-Saharan Africa in any case. So there's not so many microfinance institutions that would have their expertise. When you're looking at the local banks, so if we're looking at consumer finance, so or financing for a small business, so a small entrepreneur in Rwanda, for instance, that wants to buy a small solar home system just to charge phones or whatever, or a larger company that requires a replacement solution for a diesel generator. they will struggle to get loans for that from their local bank. The collateral requirements will be completely ridiculous. The interest rate will be ridiculous as well. So I think there is a need perhaps for intermediaries that can play a role of kind of like, you know, making it easier for the financial institutions, microfinance, local banks and so on, to understand the energy space and for the energy companies to access that type of financing more easily. I think there's a few types of vehicles and things that have been tested on that front. Yeah, this is perhaps what I've seen so far. One last thing I would mention perhaps is that you were talking about guarantees and reassuring the debt providers. You know, when you're going to see a bank, be it a local bank or Deutsche Bank with a business plan, and you're providing a document from UMEME that's gonna you know be your your key document in trying to convince them to give you a loan. It's definitely not going to be welcome, and I think the need of let's say guarantees from governments, be it you know some sort of you know first loss guarantee from USAID in Uganda or something like that. It could be interesting. I'm just not sure that I mean, at least from the space that I've been involved in. So when we're looking at distributed solar home systems and small systems, it's not really happening either. UNCDF has actually set up a facility to try to get more of these deals happening, and there's been 2 deals already last year where UNCDF is providing their guarantees. But it's pretty hard. Finding actually interesting deals in the space is difficult, and yeah. So sorry, I don't want to be negative, but.
Okay, if I may. I think there are kind of 3 issues which you have already mentioned and also have to do with the required scale for Africa with the growth which is expected and the challenges ahead. First issue is multiplicity of players, of different funding needs, different scales from microfinancing to large utility scale financing. So providing a framework where all those projects or some of them are bankable is a major challenge. We have been working with GIZ in Uganda precisely to provide that, and it's not an easy challenge, especially for smaller scale businesses. But first thing, multiplicity. Second, scalability. You need a very, very large amount of investments, a very, very large amount of instruments to provide long-term security for those investments. And the third is sustainability. I mean, nothing is going to be bankable if your business model is not sustainable in the long term. So creating the revenue stream so that is going to happen and making the kind of assurances, not only financials, but in the business model itself so that is doable, are a challenge. Let me explain. If you're subsidizing grid extension, for instance, with $1,000 per connection, which is kind of typical, 900, whatever, plus you're subsidizing also energy to low-income customers. So they also get a subsidy for their tariff. So they pay whatever social tariff is there, and you compensate the utility, the cost of service of the utility for the customer with something. And then you create a revenue of a stream for those distribution utilities, which should be healthy. That's a challenge in itself, but mostly everything is invented in that sector. Not everything, but let's say that there are models that work. But how about microgrids? Can you do the same thing for microgrids? Why are microgrids customers, either DC or AC, so different? If they are AC, they should be kind of the same thing. So why don't apply the same social tariff? Why don't provide them with upfront subsidies? And why don't provide them with subsidies to consumption if they have low income? We have calculated for Rwanda and for Mozambique that the total social tariff covered in all these different modes demands just an increase maybe of 2 or 3% of the actual tariff. So actually reaching 100% of the population from going up from 40 is not so difficult if you kind of think about the system as a whole and not think about different things in a different fashion. Solar kits, they come in another flavors and they go pay as you go. It's not pay per fee mostly. So it's a different animal, but it's still, if you think about equity, why not equality of your citizens? Why should you subsidize connected customers and not help the pay-as-you-go business. So, in a summary, sustainability would help bankability and would help scalability. Otherwise, if your business is just, okay, you install something and 5 years later, nothing, no one knows what is going to happen in the country, really, do you think anyone is going to invest the amount of billions of dollars that are required for this? So in that sense, we are kind of, some problems come from the utility mindset, some problems come from the government mindsets, but we have found that there is a common ground where a lot of investment is going to happen. So they are really willing to. So in New York, in the past climate summit, there was presented an integrated framework to try to address all these topics, and it is sponsored by the Global Commission to End Energy Poverty. That is not a very, they are thinking big, so they're not humble. But actually, it's like 10 CEOs of African utilities, the president of the World Bank, Tony Blair, Bill Gates, all people trying to foster this kind of integrated approach, because I think there is no other way, or let me say it other way. Small is beautiful will work for a lot of people, but will not work for all the people in Africa. So we need this kind of thinking big approaches.
If I can just add a little bit from from our side. So we see crowd investing as having a huge potential in terms of financing such projects. So of course we use it for our own platform. We see that there's a huge demand on the investor side. So our projects get financed really, really quickly. And then once they are, so some of them at the moment, for example, we are financing a €100,000 project in 2 or 3 days, sometimes 24 hours. And then after this is financed, you've got a 2-week period where you have to wait in case the investor changes their mind. And then after that 2-week period is over, you can mobilize that money and start building the solar project. So it's super fast. It's also very, very flexible. So you can change the conditions, the amounts, and it's democratic. So the people can choose what they want to invest in, which means that for our projects, I mean, we are working with established businesses and established industries, and we really, really want to keep basically the trust of our crowd investors. So we do very extensive due diligence and turn down projects that we think might default. However, there are riskier projects which can have a lot of impact, and there are other crowd investing platforms which do address these riskier projects. And it means that people can say, okay, I know this project is a bit risky, but I know it's also going to have an impact which is aligning with my own values. Therefore, I'm going to invest in it. I'll invest my money across a bunch of different projects and therefore diversify the risk that way. And of course, these are typically smaller amounts and smaller projects. But what we've also seen with crowd investing is that it has the potential to open up the market. So it means that you implement projects that weren't before implemented, and then people see that, okay, this works, like you get your money back, the financing works, and other financiers start to get interested. They say, okay, there's obviously a return to be made here. We're not in on that. We see that it's working, and now we want to get in on that. So it's really a way of opening up the market.
And it's also interesting, just from a CNI perspective, if you take a step back, there's a lot of risk, as we've talked about, is tied up with this idea of off-takers and governments, and CNI sector is a way. We talk about leapfrogging technology, I think was in the title of this presentation, but leapfrogging, a lot of the risks that are involved and dealing directly with businesses, and some developers have started to take a new strategy where they're investing in utility scale projects, but also having a hedge in terms of entering a market and investing in CNI solar as well. But what kind of businesses are you dealing with? It seems like it's still quite diverse in Africa about the kinds of businesses from manufacturing to mining to agriculture that you're providing energy to. What are the sort of use cases that you've seen come up?
So it's different in different countries. So for example, in Costa Rica, I mean, Costa Rica was recently voted as one of the most sustainable countries. So even though they have a high amount of sustainable energy in the grid already, a lot of it is coming from large hydro, and people there and businesses there want to be sustainable. So in Costa Rica, we see that ecotourism is a huge market for us. So most of the projects are on hotels, lodges, travel agencies that want to be even more sustainable than the country is itself. In Kenya, we have a lot of flower farms, so there's a huge floriculture industry there, and they have really like the perfect the perfect load profile and the perfect conditions for getting solar energy. So we see that as being a huge market there, and also we really have the case where once we have a customer, they're happy with what we're doing, they go and tell all of their friends, which is great, and it means that we get kind of pockets of different markets. And then in Ghana, it's a bit more diverse. So we have hospitals, universities, banks also, and some office spaces, some NGOs. So it's kind of it's much more diverse. Oh, and also some like fruit and veg processing. So at the moment, it's been more on the commercial side. I mean, we are still a startup and still kind of like finding our feet in that way, but we've got more industrial projects coming in the pipeline.
Great. And talking about use cases and what this power is being used for, sort of brings us back to the pay-as-you-go sector, and maybe talking a bit more about, and microgrids, talking about productive use is something that's come up, it's coming up increasingly as a term to define the way in which power is being used, and that's being used as criteria by international institutions or lenders for certain projects. And it's also interesting with another trend we've seen where we see quite big players in the pay-as-you-go space, like Peg Africa, for example, entering new markets and really focusing on lending out TVs, for example. And I mean, there are arguments to be made that can also count as productive use in some cases, but it's a discussion that's very much seems to be quite controversial, and it'd be interesting to get your view on it, Felix.
I mean, I think the general idea of productive use is absolutely right. Enabling people to generate more income will provide them with the ability to pay. It's absolute logic to do that. The problem is only that the device that you would have to provide them needs to be a lot more costly than the stuff that they currently purchase, which is a TV system or a lighting system. So basically, in order to piggyback a bit on, or like just making use of the term and getting more funding, I feel like a lot of companies like saying, yeah, we're doing productive use, but in the end of the day, 99% of their portfolio is TV systems. So they're selling even now the term of productive use as even a lighting system can be productive by providing it to a local small shop that can then have extended opening hours. But I think there is a limited amount of productivity lighting in itself can provide. And it's something that they have already been doing for years and years. I mean, I'm not saying we're the only one with the solution, but I believe you need to make sure that if you are a manufacturer of products or someone who sells products, you have to understand that the buying power of the people will not really change. We're talking about maybe a maximum of $1,000 of disposable income per year, and that varies different. I mean, in Rwanda, I think it's even 600 or so. So once you exceed that point, you cannot sell the device without any external subsidies or whatsoever. So that's why we currently tap in. We have that modularity where it starts as a solar home system, but it can grow into a productive use system. It's the only way I personally found, because I don't want to be the next company offering TVs, because also not only because I think it's not deserved, it's actually a problem that a TV in itself, by producing it, consumes 500 kilowatt hour of electricity, and the energy a system like this will ever create in its lifetime will never come up to 500 kilowatt hours even, So providing that kind of appliance is not really a cool thing to do. I mean, I have to say we even do it, but I would like to see the change really towards true productivity. So we also currently now have some chicken farmers in Dakar, for instance. So they pump water of 2-3 cubic meters a day, feeding more livestock and eventually creating more revenue.
And I mean, there's also something to be said for this idea of economic empowerment is important, but there's also the aim of the game at the end of the day is also universal electrification. And it's interesting to talk about whether there's a tension between those two ideas or whether they're inherently reconcilable from the get-go. Eduardo, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
Let's say the duality, you say that a possible dichotomy between like pushing for applications, let's say of purely focusing on universal access versus productive uses of energy. I think these things go hand in hand. I think we're getting to a point where it's actually inevitable to have this conversation, from a technological point of view, the cost of the technology is going down. You're able to get larger systems out there for a cheaper price, yeah, in theory. So you're gonna get to a point where the consumer won't want to have a solar lantern. 10 years ago, that was a huge, breakthrough to get a solar lantern. You still have a lot of consumers that are actually having a small solar lantern, a very, very small lantern that provides only lighting is already a huge change for them. And I've seen a lot of them in the field. But the first question you always get, and you used to get, 8-10 years ago was, when can I power a radio with this? Or I would like to have a TV because I want to watch the football game. But so I think it's inevitable to have these questions, and I think it's the right time to have these debates. Also because the fluidity between different subsectors, when you're talking about electrification and decentralized power, so the fluidity between just purely solar home systems and kits, productive applications of such, or larger systems for small businesses or mini grids and so on. We're seeing a lot of companies that are starting to kind of like explore a variety of these solutions as well, because the technology developed by the companies like Felix's company that develop very strong payment collection solutions to deal with the customers and so on can also be applied to other types of business models that are not specifically supplying power to households, but maybe to businesses. What I've seen in terms of productive uses, in my work with UNCDF in Uganda, we had a lot of, let's say, requests from donors to focus on productive uses, and the push there was on employment creation as well. So the ensuring that solar home systems are not only providing lighting, but also are promoting economic activity in rural areas. And there was a very strong link with agriculture. One of the areas where I think there is a clear, very tangible kind of opportunity, we're looking at the smaller kind of mid-sized systems, is really solar irrigation. I think there's a need. I think especially when you're looking at climate change, the current situation in countries like Uganda, which I'm very familiar with, in terms of farmers really struggling year after year because of just the lack of rainwater, which is affecting their crops, and they don't have the 2-3 harvests that they normally have. There is an opportunity there, and I think it's something that can allow to both increase access in rural areas, but also provide some productive applications of power. There's some other things that are a bit more far-fetched, and I would also tend to agree that, can you really say that a television is a productive use appliance? In some cases, perhaps. I think it's always debatable, but I think we still need to have that conversation. I think one area which I think it's quite interesting as well is refrigeration, and we're seeing more and more solutions coming up, and there's some companies, I won't name anybody, but there's some companies that are really doing some great innovation. There's a lot of public funding that's going into R&D for the type of applications. I think we're going to see more kind of low-cost refrigeration solutions for small businesses or larger systems alike. I've seen some products that are really, really quite interesting also for larger applications, which could transform certain agricultural sectors.
Thanks. I'm just conscious that, Stefan, you need to leave quite soon. Do you have time for one last question for you before we turn to questions? Sure. And it'd be great to ask you this question too, but in terms of subsidies, of something that you mentioned, you were talking about lower bids that we've seen in markets like Ethiopia for utility scale projects. And we've been seeing a lot of programs like Scaling Solar or Get Fit programs throughout sub-Saharan Africa, showing that de-risking programs can lead to very low prices for larger projects. But is there a debate to be had about whether that's a subsidy too? Because at the end of the day, the World Bank is coming in with the IFC. Just to give a bit of background, there's a lot of de-risking done from the outset in terms of securing land, in terms of providing guarantees. Could that be considered a subsidy? And are those benchmarks really realistic for developers to have when they link on certain markets?
Let me start by saying that I very much enjoyed the discussion we had here, but in the end, we are not going to fix the problem by talking about rural electrification, about the very poor, the question whether they can have a light bulb or TV. That is all important, and I really appreciate what people are doing and what I see in your businesses. But in the end, the question is about developing economies. It's about creating economic growth. It's about creating jobs for people. And jobs for people are not going to be created by giving them enough electricity to switch on a light bulb at night. It's about putting enough energy into a grid so that factories can be developed and operated. I'm working on a project in Guinea-Conakry. We are talking about a PV project for a city that's got 200,000 inhabitants. They are run only on diesel generators, and since it's too expensive to produce electricity 24/7, they have electricity 4 hours a day. So there's no bloody option to run a factory there and to give any job to any of these 200,000 people, and growing, of course. So in 5 years, we are going to see 300,000 people there. Unless we manage to get the big stuff done, we are not going to fix the problem. Once we have industry coming in, we have tax payments, we are going to see strengthening of local utilities. And in that case, maybe they can even start setting up their own programs of rural electrification. I actually also believe that we need programs to open up grid infrastructure for private infrastructure investors. Why don't we create regulation that in Uganda people can build a power line and get paid per use, paid per tariff, as is the case in Germany? It's all government monopolized so far. So we need to get big commercial money in. All the rest is nice and good, but it's limited to, I would say, money coming with a purpose. It's crowdfunding, it's development money, it's public taxpayers' money from developed countries. So for all of these business models, you need money that comes with a different risk profile or risk expectation than is going to come for the big chunks. And that is, by the way, why Mobisol went through bankruptcy, because beyond a certain point, you couldn't grow because you needed commercial money to come in, which doesn't accept that sort of risk profile. Because end customers in the bush in Africa are just not bankable. No Deutsche Bank is going to give you any loan, no infrastructure fund is going to give any equity if your security is someone in the bush in Africa paying or not paying. And that is why I believe, while we need to do all of this, we also need to find solutions for the big stuff, for big commercial money to come in. And the risk is that it's going to be Chinese-financed coal plants. If we want to avoid that, we need to come with alternative options. And that's why I'm talking about guarantees and insurance models. I don't want a subsidy, to get to your question. I don't want a subsidy for German developers. What I want is that we offer an insurance where they can pay a fee and insure themselves against failure of payment of some of these utilities. We do have this in Hermes for trade business. Yeah, it's called export credit agencies around the world. We do have this. We don't have it for off-take risk. And that, I think, is a big mistake. And rather than Gerd Müller has got another 900 million of additional money for development aid just last year. Additional money, 900 million. Let's take 100 and start funding such a pot. And let's work in cooperation with the insurance industry. They have ideas and models how to do this. If you do a portfolio across 54 countries, the risk is going to be limited. And I believe once you have this, you can convince banks that the risk in Africa is much lower than people might think. I hate us talking about risk and problems and corruption or whatever. You have all of this, but in 50% of the businesses, you don't have it. And that's what the banks don't see. So we need a few pilot projects, and they need to be insured so that they can take off. Sorry.
If I may make a quick comment to that, I don't think these two things are mutually exclusive. So so I think the challenge in this particular panel is that there's a lot of different angles to look at this question. I would agree with you of the need of creating, let's say, economic opportunities. I think it's important. I mean, and donors are actually pushing a lot for that. They say, I don't want to just get people to have lighting in their home or even to get a grid connection when they cannot even afford to pay for the electricity bill, or they don't have any appliances to actually power, because you can actually extend the grids and people won't use the power. You know, I've seen in Rwanda, which had a very successful electrification program about 10 years ago. They went from like 5%, you might correct me, Andres, to 5% to 17% or something rural electrification by extending the grid. Massive effort, financed by the World Bank. Even in a tiny country like Rwanda, they reached their limit very, very quickly. They couldn't get from the 17% to the 37% right now without actually changing their national plan for electrification by embracing decentralized renewable energy and solar kits and solar home systems. So the two things, grids, off-grids, I think go hand in hand. And actual commercial applications and industrial applications and household, I also think goes hand in hand. You mentioned Mobisol and the bankruptcy. I actually would challenge that. I think that actually that shows us that the industry is evolving and is getting more mature, that what investors are looking for is profitability in those businesses, and it's likely that you will see some businesses failing there, and you will see some acquisitions and consolidation in the sector. This is what you're seeing. NG, a massive organization with quite huge pockets, has acquired a variety of companies in the pay-as-you-go space. This tells me that there is a strategic move from their part to be part of that. They're not shutting these down. They're actually building up on the infrastructure of a Phoenix International that has now, I think, operations in something like 10, 15 countries. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just speculating here, and we're seeing companies like Bbox recently getting a pretty interesting investment from a strategic investor for Japan, which is not looking for handing out money to a non-profitable business that doesn't have the growth potential. I think these decentralized energy, so pay-as-you-go models, have to be seen as a serious contender for actually providing people with electricity in rural areas. When you're considering countries like Uganda, like Kenya, and so on, yes, there is an increasing urban population, but there is still a massive rural population which will remain rural, and which needs to be electrified. And it's a business opportunity, I think. It's not only, I think there's an opportunity there as well.
If I may just add, because I really need to run, sorry for that, but I need to catch a train to Hamburg, otherwise I'm in trouble with my next speaking opportunity this afternoon. Let me just add, I would fully agree, and I hope I was being very clear in saying I very much like all of these activities and projects. I just think we are not going to mobilize in the world enough money that comes with that sort of risk profile, which is a higher risk and at the same return, basically. So that is what we have certain sources of funding for that sort of projects that are suitable, but they are limited to a certain degree. It's going to be development related, impact investment related, etc. And that means while we are doing this, it's not going to be the single solution that's going to fix the problem. We also need to look at the big stuff that enables Africa to industrialize and to create jobs in a larger scale. What I'm saying is let's do both. Maybe the smaller scale projects are a bit more reliant on development organizations, on DFIs, on whatever FDB programs, World Bank and others. And the big commercial money that needs to come needs some push, because it doesn't flow today. It certainly doesn't flow from Europe. It starts flowing from Middle East, and it comes from India and China and other places. And I think we need to make sure that this doesn't lead to the wrong type of projects in the end. Yeah, I mean, again, you look at 1,200 new coal-fired power plants that are built around the world today, while we are talking about switching off 20 or so. So we need to make sure that Deutsche Energiewende, know-how in German Energiewende, and jobs created here in startups and in project developers do move to Africa in the next step. And since German Mittelstand and startups are a bit more, and certainly banks are a bit more risk averse than others, we need to help them coming across that hurdle. And maybe in 5 years, everybody has noticed that the risk is much smaller than they might think. I'm very sorry that I can't wait to listen for your, I'm sure, sharp counter comments, but I hope we'll have an opportunity to continue at some other point. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for being here. I think this is a good time to open things up for questions. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask our panelists?
Hi, thanks a lot for the discussion. I actually have two questions. So one is very much related to the discussion around financing. And to me, just looking at it from like reading articles every day about like, we have so much money in Europe, like the banks give like negative interest and there's like refinancing debt is really cheap. So it seems like money is not a problem, but then there seems to be a problem to have money invested in Africa. And I think that I understand like part of the problem, there is no insurance, but like what are the other opinions? Like why is there no insurance, or like what are the other obstacles to get that money that we have in Europe, let's say, to be invested in the markets in Africa?
Go ahead.
So I think there's the perception of risk is a big one. So a lot of people still, when you say Africa, then they think of like the rural side of it, which I mean, there's still a lot of people living rurally, but there's also a lot of very big productive cities, a lot of like economy, a lot of business going on. And people just don't see this. So then a lot of those people are the ones that are actually then making the decisions in the banks, for example. Am I going to lend money to Africa? Absolutely no way. So I think perception and changing people's perception of really what's going on is a big one. And then I think, I mean, I don't know so much about the actual policy in terms of insurance and that kind of thing, but I think changing that perception is a way that then will start more of a change in that. Also, just the kind of the structure to be able to move that money. So as I've mentioned before, the crowd investing for us works really well because people can just invest their money directly and then we can use it there. But of course, then you have to have structures that are people who are based in those countries. You have to have different legal structures set up to basically like move the money around, and it is possible, but it's also maybe just something that people don't really know about or don't really see as much of an option. This is again on a very small or on rather a small scale, but as I mentioned before, I think that having these kind of individual and slightly smaller scale financing options will then open up the market for both in perception terms and in terms of actually what legal structures are in place.
Okay, if I may add, and also linking it to the previous discussion, I agree with you. When first time I heard this answer that money is not a problem, I was shocked. It was in India. They had 400 million people without electricity, and the World Bank said to me, money is not a problem. And I said, can't believe it. So actually, we were talking about development funds. That's a huge amount of money that is available, and Europe is preparing a huge platform for help develop investments in Africa with billions of euros on that. But that is not enough. And then whatever the development funds are very valid and their contribution is huge, and I've been working on development 10 years of my life. For instance, the money that goes from migrants in developed countries to developing countries is 3 times the amount of money invested in development, considering all donors. So, and then private investment is even much more than that. So the problem is not if money is available, the problem is whether you're going to put your money in a country or in a project or in a community. So on that sense, first I think it's a mistake to look at these things separately. So you'd look into, well, you can look at project by project finance, that's one thing. But if you want to really raise the kind of money that is needed for universal access, you need to look into the problem as a whole. You need to look together commercial uses, industrial uses, domestic uses, and community uses, education, health, and everything. So when you're electrifying a village, you have to look at the village as a whole, and then you will use whatever technology is more suitable for each one of them, and maybe a mix of it. But then for financing, for large-scale financing, you also need a framework in the country that guarantees that whomever insurance policy is going to be there is going to be sustainable, whomever business you're going to run there is going to be sustainable as well. So it's creating that revenue stream, the one that is challenging in countries which are so unstable. Some of them are failed countries or failed governments. So actually building the kind of insurance for that comes with a prior agreement between the government, between the utilities, between the banking services. So they are all set in the same culture or in the same fashion that makes this possible. And this is kind of a large change that I think it's ongoing in Africa specifically, but it still will take time.
If I also might just add, I mean, our business is 3 years old, and basically putting together, like covering this finance gap with crowd investment is a new model. No one else was doing it. No one else is doing it still for like in these markets. I mean, you also have a young business, and there's lots of different types of sort of financing options that are coming up, but there's definitely more possibility. And I think a lot of the people here are people with ideas and wanting to start things and wanting to start new innovations. So if you see that there's a gap and you think that maybe you can cover it somehow, or you believe that there must be a way to do this, then find out how to do that and do it.
So if I may say one comment on that. So I think there's like, so to say a statement like there is money and why isn't the money flowing to projects or to these countries? So I think the thing is you have to think who has the money. So what is the money? Where is the money coming from? Are you talking from taxpayers' money? Are you talking about banking system money? So what are the banks going to invest in? So when you're talking about let's say a bank, and you're going to see a bank with your business plan as a business here, you have a solar company here, and you're going to see the bank and you're asking for a loan, and the questions that they're going to ask you, first of all, they're going to have an amount that they allocate to this type of investment, to commercial purposes, and a lot of the money will go to actually, asset-backed securities and so on, and that's the reality of the world we live in. It's a highly financialized economy, and a lot of the capital flow into these type of highly financialized kind of instruments, and that's the reality. So even for a small business in any part of the world, I don't know so much how it works here. Germany has a particular system, but it is difficult to secure debt financing. In Africa, it's even harder. That's the reality. And we're sitting here. We don't have anyone here from a local business, from an African business sitting at the table. It's even much harder. So I think there's a role that the public sector needs to play in not only de-risking, but also politically trying to push for flows of capital to go into these sectors as well. If there's no political push to try to make money flow into productive applications or applications that will increase economic activity in a country versus speculation, that's not gonna, things are not really gonna change. So that's a bigger question. And you also probably have your pension fund, and you also want to have a good return. I also want to have a good return. So that's the bigger question. When you look at it from a micro level and what needs to happen on the ground for capital to flow to companies that are doing the work on the ground, I think that your company is a good example of actually something that's needed. I was talking about intermediaries earlier. There's some companies called, like one company called Sunfunder, for instance. There's another company called Trine, which started out actually as crowdfunding platforms as well, but they moved slowly to actually play a role of intermediary, to say finding opportunities for investment or even actually not just them. There's other types of investors that are doing equity that are actually very specialized in the off-grid solar sector, for example. And what they're doing is that they're opening the door to companies that don't necessarily have the credibility, or that there's a high risk perception from the debt providers to tap into money from development finance institutions, but also from private sources. I think there's a need for more intermediaries. There's not enough. And especially when you're looking at local, small companies in African countries, if we want to electrify the continent, we'll need a lot more of them, and they're facing even greater challenges. If you don't have money to buy, your next container of products, you can't really plan your business ahead of time. You have, it's impossible to run a business and scale it, pretty much.
Thanks a lot. I think that's like a great discussion that could lead for a long time. I had one other quick question. I hope that it's okay.
We have a couple of other questions, so if we have time, we might come back to you if that's all right.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah, hi, my name is Nico, and you, Andres, with your answer, you were touching on the topic. I want to ask, how does political stability, instability in different places affect the possibility to do investments and to do businesses?
I could quickly answer that. It highly depends. So when you are in West Africa, for instance, you probably know that the currencies are connected to this. The CFA is there in, I think, 16 countries, former French colonies. And that CFA currency is bound to the euro. So despite countries eventually crashing, it is still a relatively stable currency, which I think in West Africa has a big, reason why you can do maybe better businesses and maybe better bankability for that. But if I just recently discussed also with a local bank in Zambia, this is sort of like a development bank. Not telling you the names, but so the reason why you cannot get any loans, and I think you also mentioned it, is that the local currency in the last 16 months or so crashed by 40%. So if they borrow that money for 40%, they can maybe give you the best deal. They can give you 60% on the dollar per year. So I think that's very critical, but it is very, very different from country to country. There's also certain regulations in Ethiopia, for instance, where it's almost impossible to get your money out of there. So if you have a purely European business without, direct involvement of an Ethiopian in Ethiopia, forget it. Like, you're never going to return your money from Ethiopia back to Europe also. So again, very, very different depending on market to market.
Well, if I may add, also, there are two things. One is the way you can get finance, or you can get banking money. The other is, there are more resilient business models than others. So it's different to raise 300 million to build a distribution line that is going to be there for 25 years. So you have to get sure your revenue stream is going to pay off for your investment. So you have to kind of have an assurance from the government or from someone that for 25 years, your income is going to cover that investment. So that's a huge risk. And that is not going to happen if the country is not stable enough. So that's other questions. And that's why pay-as-you-go schemes are much more resilient and suitable for a variety of situations, but still they suffer from the financial risk of being able to pay for the 5 years or whatever and then get the return on that. So that's why stability and establishing a framework that covers, and that is a problem mainly for viable businesses. So if the customer is able to pay for the system in whatever the time they have to pay it, then you get the microfinancing, then it would work. But what if the customer is not paying? Or, for instance, utility in Nigeria. 1/3 of the customers, of the 500,000 customers they have in North Nigeria, 1/3 of them pays their bills. 1/3 of them have illegal connections, so you're never expecting them to pay the bill. And the 3/3 of them has a contract but is unable to pay, so he doesn't pay. So actually, 1/3 of the people is paying for the whole system. So the company is bankrupt, obviously. So the government keeps injecting money into the company, and that is kind of the day-to-day life of many of the utilities in Africa. This is not an exception. So in order to change that, first, you need to provide the means so people pay whatever they can pay. And if the cost of service, which is in the way you pay regulated service to become stable for 25 years, so people is able to risk their money in long-term investments, in heavy capital assets, someone has to put that money. So you have whatever is the cost of service, you have whatever is the affordability of the people, and then in the middle, there's a viability gap that some has to go for it. So usual practice in the power sector is there are cross subsidies. There are customers that pay more, there are customers that pay less, and somehow inside the system there's an implicit cross subsidy that covers for the difference. For instance, supply in Berlin is going to be, let's say, $2, 2 cents per kilowatt hour. It's very, very, very cheap. Supply in a very rural area of Germany is going to be maybe $2 per kilowatt hour. So it can be 100 times more. No one realizes that because everyone in Germany is paying the same price. But actually that is happening, and that happens in Europe, in the United States, in all developed, but no one is thinking about that because that is implicit in the way the distribution system works. So why not doing that also for off-grid systems? That's one of the things. You are going to have always a viability gap, especially in the base of the pyramid. Or you will supply them with only very, very, very basic electricity that is not going to be able to foster or to unchange the virtuous circle of development, let's say that. But if you arrange the system in such a way in which wealthy customers and non-wealthy customers are compensated, it would work. It would work at a national level, and also OECD has calculated that by raising the tariff of developed countries in 0.7%, we could cover all the money that is needed for universal access. But who in Germany, Spain, France, or United States is going to pay 0.5% more for his electricity? Well, maybe we can, but that's the kind of money we're talking about. 0.7% of the present energy bill or electricity bill of the developed world.
Thank you. I think we've reached our time limit. So first of all, thank you for being here. We covered a lot of ground. As with a lot of subjects, as broad as this one, probably left you with a lot of questions. So a few of our panelists will probably be sticking around afterwards if you want to ask them anything. I'm sure they'll be happy to talk to you. But yeah, I think a few of them also went without lunch for this panel. So if I could get a really big round of applause for them and for being here. Thank you very much.